So that way, if they do a reference check, it's still there. But when someone looks at the resume, they're going to say, oh yeah, sales rep, that's what I'm looking for. All right? So that's just a trick that I learned. Because you don't want to be a slave to bad titles, and a lot of people are slaves to bad titles. Okay? Any other questions about the how to compile the experience section? Okay, there are maybe some other sections. Well, there'll be an education section, obviously. But I like to be careful not to be section heavy, have 15 different sections in a resume, because first of all, it takes a lot of space, and secondly, you lose some impact. One of the things that people tend to misuse a lot is the technical skills section, because technical skills sections are good for technical people, but if you use Word or Excel or PowerPoint, that's really not a technical skill. And sometimes by creating a technical skills section, you're pretty much screaming that all I know is Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. It sort of has a reverse psychology, right? It's much more effective within the job you used Word and Excel in to say that I did mail merges using Word, or I created a new report using Excel, or I did presentations for the CEO using PowerPoint. You get more points for it because it shows it in context. You save space because you don't have a separate section, and you're not drawing attention to the fact that, well, gee, I really wanted you to know Illustrator, and you don't know Illustrator, or whatever. I don't know Illustrator, so I would be in that group. So a lot of times what I'll do is if someone has like one certification, I might create a section, education and certifications, so that I can put them together. I don't have to have a whole bunch of different settings. If they have associations and memberships, sometimes I'll combine those. Okay, so you can kind of look at doing those kinds of things. And if anyone has specific issues, I can handle them. Does anybody have any specific issues in terms of sections and resumes or formatting?
What if you don't have any of those? What if you don't have any certifications?
Yep.
You don't have a college degree, so you don't want to do an education.
Yep. Yep.
What do you do?
Have you ever gone to college?
Yes.
Okay. What I do with people that have taken one class in college is I create an education section, I list the college, I list the program that I was in or I intended to get, and that's it. You're not going to put a date or anything like that, but that's still very true. If Northeastern, liberal arts, whatever it is, no dates or anything, someone's going to look at it and quickly, it's not going to jump out that you're missing the credential. If you don't have an education section, then it kind of jumps out that you're missing it. Okay? Now, with high school, I don't like to normally include high school unless that's the credential they want. Okay, if the jobs they're applying for, they say we want high school graduate, then it would be a plus to put it in there. Otherwise, if you put high school, basically what you're saying is they don't have college, if there's no college, right? I'd rather not have the section at all and draw their attention, right? A lot of times I'll even put like awards and things within the chronology. So I love to do that with, I just wrote a resume the other day for a guy that was in sales, and he had a lot of awards, but he didn't say what anything was. He had a separate section. And I just moved him up into his work section, and I was able to say in 2011 he won this award, 2010 he won this award, and visually it's much more powerful because I can connect it to keywords as opposed to just having them sitting out there all by themselves and having the keywords in the job without showing that I did any of them particularly well, right? So cover letters are interesting because you need to have a cover letter, but most people don't read them. I would be very surprised if over 5% of cover letters were read. Well, this is if you're sending them electronically. I mean, if you can get them hand-delivered, a little different, because it's a cover letter then, right, because it's covering something. But when you're sending something electronically, it's not covering anything anymore. Normally they just sort of like, yeah, whatever, because they're looking at the resume. And I actually saw a graphical representation of how people look at resumes. There was a I can't remember what website it was. It was one of the job search sites out there, and they actually put hardware on people that could track their vision. Did you see it? Did you see that? Yeah, and they showed like resumes with hot spots, right? And where people's eyes would go. And it would be white if they didn't look at it at all, and it would be like pale yellow if they looked at it a little, and it would be like crimson if they looked at it a lot. And the things that were crimson were job titles, companies, and dates. Okay? So when people look at resumes, this is what they do, right? And so they don't really read unless that stuff hooked them. So the cover letter tends to get flipped to the back so that they can do that power thing to see whether or not it's this or this, right? And computers don't care about cover letters. So, the odds are, I'm just going to give you an honest statistic that if you apply for jobs that you're somewhat qualified for, your expectation should be maybe 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 10 is ever going to get back to you. Okay? 1 out of 3 positions are not open for competition. So if everyone you see, a third of them really aren't available. We don't know which third. Those aren't looking at your cover letter, right? The other ones maybe compete and maybe you're one of 30 qualified people, but they only want to talk to 7, right? So you're one of the 23 awesome folks that they just don't get to, right? They're not going to read your cover letter, right? So the only ones that may read your cover letter are the ones that get through all that process, and when I interview those people, very few of them look at them either, but some do. And we don't know going in which ones they are. So what I recommend for people to do is to have a well-written cover letter that is sort of a utilitarian version that can cover most of the things we'd apply for. I only recommend customizing them, really putting in customized work if we can get it to a person. So you need to have a good, well-written cover, customize it only if you can get it to a person so it's really a cover, right? There's so many better things you could do to find a job than writing. Okay, here's the scenario. A client hired me to help him kind of get himself repositioned. He was essentially a programmer in computers, and he had been out of work for 4 years. Now, in the computer world, might as well be 100 years, okay? Because, everything is different in technology in 4 years. And so he said to me, I've been out for 4 years just because I didn't feel like working. Now I feel like working. I just kind of feel weird I'm not working. So can you help me write a resume? And I said, gulp, sure. And so I asked him, I said, have you done anything at all in the last 4 years with technology? And he said, well, nothing really for pay. And I said, well, what else is there? He said, I did go and take a class in a tool called Ruby on Rails, which is a very, very hot commodity. And I said, did you actually do any projects in your class? And he said, well, I actually did a project that was a time and attendance system that could be used at a company. He said, but no one ever used it. I said, I don't care, okay? Because you did a time and attendance system using Ruby on Rails. And I can truthfully say that you did it. I don't have to say that anyone used it. I can still say you did it. I said, what else did you do? He said, I have a hobby that has to do with this internet virtual game thing where I play a character, and I actually developed a tool to go along with it. And I said, is it something where there's a web link for it that someone could go look at your work? He said, yeah. And so I said, we can put that into your resume, right? And then I asked him a couple other things, and so what I was able to do is come up with 4 projects that he had done over the 4 years he's been out, all of which was able to use the keywords of the jobs we were targeting. And the resume that I produced is on the next page. So what we have is we have the headline of a software designer and a summary and key skills, which are key skills that he has and which are in demand. And you can see how I characterize the 2004 to present. Obviously, I did this a couple years ago, but it's such a great example. So I called him a freelance designer. A lot of people had a question about how do you handle this, and this is how I handled it here. I took what his intent was and took the language. So I went out and I looked and said, okay, what does a software developer do? And I created a job description for him saying this is what I did. Now, I didn't do it for everybody, but I did some of it for somebody. And then I came up with some engagements underneath so that now we're able to show current utilization of the skills that they're looking for. I've done the same kind of thing using academic experience, where I've put the academic experience at the top and talked about projects that I did in college that allowed me to be able to show that I demonstrated the skills that the jobs were looking for. Both of them are pretty powerful tools and help to fill that gap. Okay, so that's how I did it here, and that's how I've done it with some other folks. A lot of times when I write a summary statement, if I have a career that seems to be, a career that seems to be disjointed, I'll tell the story at the top. For example, if I'm working with somebody that has had sales experience and they've been a computer programmer, okay? And they want to go out and help companies to they want to help companies to be able to use a product that they bought. What I'll say at the top is looking to combine experience from this, from this career and from this career to be able to provide, a unique perspective on being able to do this job. Okay, so sometimes that's appropriate to be able to say, okay, if there's some value in the older stuff, maybe it's better to say that that's my baseline of stuff. I went back to get credentials, and now I'm going to be combining all of these things. I don't know if that works for you. The other thing in terms of chronology is normally when you build a resume, you start with the headline, then the summary, then work experience, then education. In your case, you're probably going to want to reverse the education and experience sections, and probably in your case too, so that when someone looks at the top of the resume, they see the education, because the education is the most relevant thing to the job that they're filling. So at the top, they go, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Then you can build the education out, looking at projects that you did or classes that you took, so that they can look at it and they can make a connection and understand. And then that pushes the work history down a little bit. So sometimes a job like that ends up being on page 2 and not on page 1, so that it's not quite so, odd. We talked about how many resumes do you have, right? What I do is I always pick like a primary job to go after. Right? So I pick what's the most likely thing, and I build a resume for that. Then what I do is I say, okay, I'm going to go look, if I want to do something that's a little different, I'm going to go look at job descriptions for that. And I'm going to say, is there a way that I could introduce the keyword language from those jobs into my base document without wrecking the base document? Because the worst thing you can do is be mediocre to everybody. It's better to have a really great resume for one thing than to build a resume to try to cover a bunch of stuff. So if it's too far afield, you may have to have multiple resumes, okay? Sometimes 2. I very rarely get into situations where I need more than 2. One of the things that I bear in mind is that if you're somewhat young and you're going to have a social media presence for a while, somewhat young, being 50s, then you got to understand that people are going to look you up. Right? So sometimes we have to stake ground. You talked about branding. We have to stand for something, because they're going to look you up on LinkedIn anyway. So you could write a different resume that may work a little bit, but we really need to focus on being really qualified for stuff. And there's a lot of ways to become a content expert now that you never had before, like going out and sharing articles and stuff. And volunteerism, once again, I would treat that in the same vein as we talked about, education, where but you could even put your volunteerism at the top. I've done that before, where I've actually used volunteers as mini projects, right? The bottom line is that the best way to find jobs is not by sending paper first, no matter what your paper looks like. Even if you have a great looking resume, it's still not going to be the way. Most people don't get jobs that way. Most people get jobs because they happen to be able to network with somebody or be able to have a conversation with somebody, right? And if you do it that way, then a lot of these things just become less significant because the paper follows you. You make an awesome first impression, and then the paper's like, oh, well, okay. Whereas putting the paper first, you got to go in, and then you got to defend right away, right? And even if it's perfectly qualified, it's still that way. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. All right. Thanks.